Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to all of you joining us from both sides of the Atlantic in the United States and in Germany. We're very, very excited to have you with us today. My name is Catherine DiPaula from 1014, and we're delighted to co-present our first program with the DIE Heidelberg in their exciting Art and AI series. Discussing questions of AI and its imagined or even real potential when it comes to memory preservation and recreation is a fascinating topic, and we're grateful to be part of the conversation. Allow me to briefly introduce 1014 before handing to our host and wonderful colleague, Lena Jung, Program Director of the DIE. So 1014 is a New York-based organization at home in a beautiful townhouse on Fifth Avenue across from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we're dedicated to serving as a transatlantic platform that bridges society, culture, and ideas. Our goal is to explore the pressing challenges and opportunities of our times by fostering meaningful partnerships that shape our collective future and contribute to important global conversations. If you would like to learn more about us and stay up to date with our current programs, I would like to encourage you to sign up for our newsletter at 1014nyc.com if you have not done so. And with that, I thank all of you again for joining. Thank you, Amy and Anne, for agreeing to share your expertise and thoughts. And thank you so much, Lena, for this great opportunity and truly inspiring collaboration. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you for your introduction and good afternoon from Heidelberg. You see the building I'm sitting in my background. My name is Lena Jung. I'm the program director of the German American Institute in Heidelberg. Our institute is known for a culture program with very high-level speakers from cultural, scientific, and political field. And the institute is also a literature center in town. And we organize a big science festival every year in fall. And it's a pleasure to announce that Amy, who is here with us today virtually, will be a guest at this year's festival on October 16th in Heidelberg. So this is kind of a kickoff event for the time we will have together in Heidelberg. My special thanks go to 1014 New York. It's a wonderful institution and a very valuable partner for programs. So Katja and Katrin, thank you very much for your openness and for your kindness. In today's online event, Digital Echoes, AI, Memory, and the Art of Immortality, we explore the fascinating question of how artificial intelligence might help us to preserve and reimagine family histories. Let me introduce you very briefly our two guests, Amy Kurzweil and Ann Cotten. Amy Kurzweil is an accomplished cartoonist and writer whose work combines visual storytelling with profound narratives about family, memory, and identity. Her cartoons appear regularly in The New Yorker. Recently, her new graphic novel, Artificial, a Love Story, I have it here, quite big, has been published. And in this compelling work, she documents her father, Ray Kurzweil's innovative attempt to make family history accessible through artificial intelligence. The novel examines what happens when we try to recreate loved ones through technology, something we might be able to do in the future. But the question is, do we want to follow that path? Amy Kurzweil will be in conversation with the wonderful Ann Cotten tonight. Ann Cotten is an Austrian writer and literacy scholar born in the United States. Her work explores the intricate relationship between human and artificial creativity. Both authors got in contact through 1014 and the DIE, and I think they are ideal dialogue partners for examining questions of digital memory and preservation. In the next 45 minutes, Amy and Ann will explore the boundaries between human and artificial intelligence and consider how technology might shape the future of personal and family narratives. So very warm welcome to you, Amy Kurzweil, and to you, Ann Cotten. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Lena. It's
Thank
great
you.
to be here. It's really exciting for me to be able to talk to you, Amy Kurzweil, because your work really, really stunned me, and I also just simply vastly enjoyed reading it. It seems like it comes at a really important moment to expand talking about AI from sort of success stories versus anti-tech criticism, and really to explore what the relation between human machine users, the concept of machines, and the continually evolving new technology actually is, how is it working, and how have we been using it, and do we have choices in how we want to be using it? And so, without being in a single second didactic in any way, this this graphic novel is captivating. It's I really couldn't put it down, although I wanted to go outside, which is really unusual for me. And so I was really thrilled. Let's see, to give a short overview, um, the narrative follows or sort of circles around this event of construing a chat bot, if that's the right term. It's not exactly an AI, right? It's a chat bot fed with the documents and information from the deceased grandfather of the narrator, right? And the father of the narrator, the son of the grandfather, is a man called Ray Kurzweil, who has been in the media, also in the narrative, for proposing radical new ideas or new ways of thinking about humanity, pattern recognition, and the values that we want to have as legacies or whatever. And so there's a lot of exciting thought back there. And then there's this person, Amy Kurzweil, who has a, a astute sense of humor, who's a figure and at the same time someone in the backgrounds drawing the what how do you say? I'm a little bit German, organizing the narrative. And I love the way the narrative is organized because it works more like human memory than like what we're used to in terms of linear narrative. And so that means the things are thematically organized. They jump, they do flashbacks. There's bits of theory coming in. I would kind of call it auto theory as it switches between narrative and explaining and reflection. And basically, I wanted to start this conversation. If you were so kind enough to, so kind as to prepare a presentation to show a few pages. So we would just start from the top and
Mhm.
look at some paratexts that this book starts with, because in this graphic novel, each detail is really almost an explosion of food for thought,
Yeah, thank
explosion
you.
of
And
food.
I will share, but before we do that, I just want to start by thanking you for reading my book so closely with such generous attention. I feel like that's what I wrote this book for, is specifically for people like you to read it. So I just wanted to start the conversation by thanking you. And yeah, I'm just like, based on what we've shared previous to this moment, I'm really interested and excited about the ways you're observing how the form of my book is speaking to these larger themes, right? So the way it's organized or the details on the page. So I just really appreciate you giving the book that attention and all the nice things you said about it. So yeah, we'll start from the beginning and see where you want to start here.
You're right. Indeed, it's the dedication. It's a culture that's slightly different in Germany or German-speaking places and in the US, because there's a lot of almost every book has a dedication in English, right? And in German,
Mhm.
that's not the case. So we look at this and we notice the statistics. There's often women being thanked for being so patient with the author. Probably, I don't know, 70%, 80%. It's
The
hoped to change.
long-suffering wife,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And so now we have two long-suffering men, or maybe inspiring men, or whatever. But I really like that turnaround. And then another turnaround, which comes with this picture that is fascinating. You might first think it's dad with the daughter, but then you look closer and think, oh, it's probably partner.
Hmm. Hmm.
And they're sort of floating, both of them. You could sort of see them spiraling around into a far-off galaxy. So um, but to focus on the words, actually, there's one word that intrigued me, and because of someone who's maybe more familiar with Kant than with transhumanism, I I was a little bit wondering what exactly does transcendence mean here?
Yeah, that's such a great place to start. And yeah, I guess I'll just say that I love this sort of idea that women are usually being thanked. And in the beginning of my book, I'm sort of thanking the men because I do think a big part of the impetus for a book like this for me was in trying to approach traditionally male ideas about ambition and the sort of male stories that I'd inherited in my family on my father's side and my father's father, these stories of great ambition, trying to situate myself in relationship to that grand ambition, knowing that I was coming at it from, you could call it a feminist perspective, but just who I am as a woman in the world. And that is really a big part of this book. And so I can talk about what transcendence means in my family history, and I can also talk about what it means in the context of transhumanism, and things my father has said about transcendence. And I'd love to hear how that sort of jives with your understanding of transcendence. But so in my family, in the historical sense, because I come from this Jewish family with a Holocaust legacy, and one of the themes in Artificial is that my grandfather was born in Austria, in Vienna, and he fled the Nazis in 1938. And a big part of the reason why he was able to escape is because he's a musician, and there's this epic story of a woman hearing him play in 1937, conducting this choral concert, and this American wealthy woman, she sort of saved his life because she told him at that concert, if you ever need anything, I'm in America, let me know. And the next year, after the Anschluss, he needed to get out of Vienna, and so he contacted her. And so the story that I inherited, from my grandfather through my father, is that music saved my grandfather's life. And it was his artistic talent and his kind of genius that allowed him to escape certain death in Europe. And so there's that sort of inheritance of your talent and your artistic abilities are the thing that help you transcend death, right? So there's a relationship there between like transcendence about being connected to life and longevity. So that's the family inherited sort of sense of transcendence. When it comes to my father's transhumanist ideas, so my father, Ray Kurzweil, is known for writing about the singularity and this vision of humans and machines merging, and a sort of future in which humans are not bound by what we think of as kind of traditional biology, that we extend and to a certain extent, we're all already sort of living in that world. Like we are sort of we're extending our longevity through technology in so many ways. Human lifespan has expanded, greatly beyond sort of how long we used to live, and our capabilities, the way we navigate time and space is so different than, the hunter-gatherers of history. Um, but so for my father, transcendence, I mean, I ask him in Artificial later in the book, how do you define transcendence? And for him, transcendence has to do with the way in which the effect of material parts, um, from human perception, seem much greater. It's just this concept of like, the sum, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And one example that he always gives when you say what is transcendence is he says music is transcendent because we have sheet music, we have this kind of code for what music is supposed to be. And our experience of music does not have anything to do with like our perception of the sheets on the page, right? Like music is so much more than what it appears to be when you kind of break it down into its material parts or into its code. And I think that's a really interesting thing to hear from someone like my father, who is like a materialist and, thinks that the world is knowable and can be broken down into sort of parts that we can then reproduce. Because he's still acknowledging that the experience of any material world is much greater from human perception than we can really explain. And so I think for my father, transcendence is kind of like where he would locate a sense of spirituality. And it might not be a sort of traditional sense of spirituality, but it is this kind of wonder at the fact that things are so much greater than the parts that we break them down into. Um, and yeah, I'll just say one more thing about the little drawing. I'm I'm happy you noticed that because for me this is playing multiple playing multiple roles. One, it's a little bit of a reference to my favorite graphic novel, which is Fun Home. Because Fun Home began, which is a story by an American graphic memoirist who's writing about her relationship to her father, and she begins her book with this airplane scene, with this kind of like the father holding the daughter up in this flying circus airplane. So it's a little bit of a reference to that, and then it's also there's something funny, I think, about the concept of transcendence then juxtaposed with just two human people clearly not flying. Like they're clearly holding each other up in order to have a kind of experience of transcendence. And, so much of this book is about love and connection and human connection. And I think I'm trying to say that that's really the where I personally find transcendence is through human connection.
I thought also that that sort of tickled instincts of understanding, and also the notion that you can't understand something alone. Really, you can't even learn language alone. So you're always part of, as a language user, you're part of a larger community, even when you are sitting alone in front of your laptop. And the same with anything really, right? And so the image of depending on someone else for flying seems like a really, really nice image to at the
Hmm.
same time tie transcendence down. But another side of the question is then also maybe if, asking, is this an optimist idea or is it actually neutral? Because the way I read it, the most interesting way to read it is to see it's neutral. Like progress is not necessarily making things better. We don't really know, but we're changing things. And we know that humans have the capacity to do very destructive and idiotic things that animals would never even think of doing. We don't really
Hmm.
need to value things, maybe. And as a
Hmm.
woman, I think it's particularly interesting if we can, like, we've already, thanks to the pill, transcended this sort of problem of our high mortality rate, or mortality rate and also dropout rate from like school or jobs to focus on child rearing. That's something that we can do, but we don't have to do. So that really changes the concept of being a woman, I think. And for
Hmm.
me, I think much for the better. But then at the same
Hmm.
time, I think, how dependent am I on technology in order to be myself?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so then, yeah,
The question about transcendence being positive or negative or neutral is actually really interesting because I think our bias is to think that transcendence is this wonderful positive thing, right? The word conjures like a really positive feeling, but it might be it might be neutral, right? Transcendence is really just change. It's like a sort of there's this sort of state change when you think about things transcending and
yeah, death
um
too, just
yeah.
something that happens, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
But maybe another difficult question I think it's important to touch upon is the question of like class, race, inequality. That,
Hmm.
as we know, um, AI currently really like amplifies the biases that are inbuilt in our society, unfortunately, and it
Hmm.
runs on a lot of underpaid labor.
Hmm.
So how could transcendence or how could this kind of project actually benefit many kinds or many people in many different situations? Or is it going to be an elite project under the sort of capitalist assumption that somehow meritocracy just works like an evolution, that the best sort of get more money because they're better
Hmm.
and that they sort of are also economically more successful? I don't quite believe that because so many people who don't even get a chance. So
Hmm.
so how is the relation between these actually quite moving and um, emotional, so altruistic sounding family love and interdependent narratives and the larger scale social issues that
Yeah.
tech has to deal with?
I mean, that's such a big question that I can't answer, but I think my approach to thinking about how to engage with AI, with the humanistic, class conscious, race conscious, bias conscious agenda is to tell stories about AI that are about real people. So I think, a big part of the project of this book, Artificial, was about um, taking the readers through the experience of AI affecting a real human life and making really clear that this chatbot that was built, from my grandfather's archives only is meaningful because of the relationship to those archives, and only is meaningful because of the labor that I and other people, some of whom are featured in the book, are putting into that project. And I think there's something like kind of paradoxical about this book in general. The fact that it's called artificial and it's every page is handmade. The fact that it's like about AI, but it's actually about this one extremely limited, now outdated, large, medium-sized language model. Like the book is really just about this one very, very limited experience of like using a chatbot, which, you said, maybe it's not AI, but it's using some AI, it's using some natural language understanding in order to facilitate the back and forth. And once you understand the technology and how it's working, um, it's not, it starts to become sort of like commonplace or like, seems like an illusion, right? The way this chatbot is working is it's just like has some vector space understanding of language. You ask it a question and it goes into its archive and finds a passage and delivers that passage as an answer. That's the way the chatbot works in this book. Um, and once you understand that there's really just this kind of simple sort of input output, which has some mystery to it, but like the exchange itself is actually somewhat simple, but all of the archive in this large language model exists because me and others like sat there in front of a computer and typed it up. I feel like testifying to that, to like just the kind of infinity of labor that's involved in that was part of my way of, I don't have the answer for like how to organize society so that things are more just, but I do think if we can understand all these little individual moments of labor and sort of honor them and understand that like they're not disembodied, that like every piece of information is actually coming from like a human body and a human life. I think if we can deepen our appreciation of that, that's the path, to sort of a more just world and a world in which AI helps play a role in sort of helping imagine that kind of justice. So there is something like sort of paradoxical about this idea that thinking about AI and appreciating AI might help us actually appreciate human minds and human bodies and human labor. But I tend to think about artificial intelligence and technology as an art form more than as like some sort of other force in the world. And so for me, anything that I might say about AI is something that I might say about art and music and poetry. And the word artificial like is related to of course, the word art and the word artifice. Um, so I think, it's probably not a satisfying political answer, but for me, I think deepening our appreciation of sort of like where AI comes from is the path towards that more just world.
Well, one of the things that you do really well in the comic is like setting, it doesn't go deeply into tech history or something, but what it does is you see interfaces and people interacting with interfaces in many different settings. I mean, I think it
Mhm.
must be super interesting also for interface designers and things like the artificial cat or the cat Turing test is one of your New Yorker cartoons that I really like. It's super laconic, but it's or also just well, I think it was later on in page 185 or 6 or something, but there's a frame that has I think 4 strips kind of interwoven showing
Mm.
different people in different reading scenes and all of these different moments that we spend with different
Yeah.
media. And
Hmm.
it's just beautiful. And you have people in relationships beside each other using media. And in fact, I was speaking of appreciation, though, I would be curious to hear about how you actually went about um, writing and drawing this because it's your second book, right? And I heard
Hmm.
that the first one took a long time and you wanted to write something that would be a little bit faster. But you say you
Yeah.
didn't use AI to help, but you did use digital drawing, or how did you technically work this comic?
I, yeah, I didn't use digital drawing, and this book definitely was not faster than my first book, but I got into writing New Yorker cartoons because I wanted to do something fast, but this book was not fast. It definitely took a long time. And I drew by hand, which made it take much more time. And I think another one of the interesting paradoxes of like a book about AI um, that's done by hand is that AI is so much about saving time and efficiency. Like in the marketplace, we think about AI as existing to sort of help us navigate tons of information quickly, to do jobs that would take, years and days, to solve problems that would take years and days, right? Like that's one of the sort of ideas we have about what AI should do. But for me, this book just took so long because I was having to, I mean, this was part of my artistic agenda, but I was, like trying to reproduce the digital world with like kind of handmade lines and having to think about like every little detail that's on a phone and make decisions about like what I wanted to include from those digital interfaces. And something that this book did for me, which I think was by design for my own edification, was help me appreciate the infinity of information in my purview as a human person. And that was a project that I undertook because I wanted to appreciate the difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. And I felt that in order to appreciate that, I needed to reflect on my relationship to my senses. Um, and like specifically just the amount of information, visual in the case of a graphic novel, I was reflecting specifically on visual information, just as an example of the kind of density of information that I am processing all the time. Like if I want to just temporarily consider the metaphor that I'm a machine, which I don't fully accept that metaphor, but just as a hypothetical, if I am a machine, the amount of information that I'm processing is like so astronomical as to almost be infinite. And I just think sometimes we forget about that. Like we just forget about how much we are processing through our senses. And then in the AI world, there's a lot of reflection on sort of the discrepancy between what you can measure and what you can't, what you can collect data about and what you can't. And I just think one of the biggest issues with AI is this huge gap between what actually can be collected and recorded and documented by machines and what it actually is to like live a human life. And I think if there's anything that this book helped me gain an appreciation of, it's that. It's just like sort of how, even if I buy the project that we, you know, we could document all of human sensory experience and then take all of that and create a sort of digital replication of human experience. We're so far from being able to do that. We're just like laughably far. Um, and so, yeah, the sort of like once you appreciate the gap between what you can collect information about and what you can't, I think it starts to become really clear that the chatbot of my grandfather is is like it's not him. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of a shadow of his identity, which I needed another framework for kind of understanding what that was. What are the little shadows that we kind of leave in the world? It's not him. Like it's something else, and it's still beautiful and it's still meaningful, but it's not like anywhere near a recreation of a person.
I think this it's a super huge topic and super interesting topic. Um, the the structure is not irrelevant, right? Because one of the reasons why like I also wouldn't want to live in a completely simulated world, not because I'm against simulation or the digital in itself, but because the structure of the way things have been organized in the history of digitalization is very much following an Aristotelian linear way of thinking. And if like Tracy K. Smith, whom you quote at the beginning, writes, there will be no edges but curves. I've been trying to figure out what does that actually mean? What could that mean? And one way would be different kinds of mathematics, right? There's kind of container thinking, and then there's algorithmic thinking that a function, you have infinity in every little point. And this would go too far, but I'm kind of interested in Kyoto School philosophy because with the Buddhist and Chinese tradition, there's a slightly differently functioning logic that allows you to have non-linearity, but an equal strictness. And it's also structuralism, but it isn't this boxy kind of structuralism, putting things in categories and then having these edges. So I think the complementarity of different ways of measuring things are super exciting. But in fact, the way things have been going now, a lot of the stupidity of maybe the last 200, 300 years of Eurocentric history has been strongly inscribed into technohistory. And that's the problem in my view. But where do we go from here? Because that's the facts. That's where we are standing now. We're not going to undo computer history. So I think one interesting way is something that you as as cartoon artists, and I also dabbled in that a little bit, enough to know some tricks, is that like reducing information is actually a very exciting way to get the readers or the viewer's brain to connect the dots and make a much more vivid picture than if you had actually spelled out all the details. And that already sort of disproves this sort of linear fantasy of reproduction in the sense of the more details, the more information, the more is better kind of ideology
that's really
reproduction.
interesting. That's really interesting. I mean, I think like just to meditate on this quote from Tracy K. Smith's poem for a second. Yeah, the idea that we have curves instead of edges and that history will be replaced with nuance. I was just really taken with this idea that the sort of the way in which trying to collect information and plot out reality becomes fuzzy when you replace history with nuance. You replace facts, right? These like we've decided this is what things are with a concept of something that's like a little bit you're acknowledging the blurriness of like of sort of our ability to pin down the past. Um, and that instead of an edge, instead of a point, we have a curve. I don't know enough about math to understand the significance of that, but it's like I was drawn as somebody who makes associations to visual abstractions. Like I was drawn to sort of the feeling of that way of thinking about reality and that way of thinking about sort of like how we might how writing this book about like what is a person and how do you document a person might help me appreciate the kind of infinities of a curve or of nuance. And I think, I mean, I hadn't put this together, but I do think that there's something about cartooning, and it goes back to sort of what we were saying at the beginning. There's something about the dialogue of cartooning and the shared, the fact that like what is on the page is a collaboration between me making, lines and shapes and you filling it in. And in comics, we call that iconic abstraction. So like the less I put into this face, the more that you bring your own expression to it. And there's something about that, the white space of, especially when you're doing a face, like the white space around the mouth and like the arch of the eyebrows, like this face is saying a lot more than I could say in words. And that's because of the density of experience in your face and your brain. Like you are putting so much into this image and making it live. Um, and I think that that is something we, in experiences of, for example, large language models, like how meaningful an experience is it to just have a large language model tell you stuff? Like if you're looking for like kind of relational sort of, if you're looking for a relationship or if you're looking for the kind of knowledge that comes from a relationship, there needs to be space in order for you to get anything out of the exchange. And so something that I was noticing with the chatbot of my grandfather when I interacted with it was that there was something about the limitations of the technology that actually made it more meaningful for me. Because when I would ask the chatbot a question, it would return a passage that was sort of like loosely associated with the question that I had asked it. I don't have any examples in the presentation right now, but I'd ask it like, what's the meaning of life, for example, to riff on this question here. And it would bring back a passage from, my grandfather's writing about music and writing about companionship in his chorus. And that left enough space for me to sort of understand him and understand around that passage. Like it's not like he was answering the question directly, like, I, Fred Kurzweil, think the meaning of life is this. It was just giving me sort of something poetic that then it would ignite my imagination. And I think that those kinds of projects are artistic projects. Like whenever you are giving people space to bring their own intelligence to the page and collaborate with you, I think those are the kinds of quests for knowledge that I'm most interested in.
Yeah, it's also definitely this bias that something is better than nothing that leads to current large language models hallucinating and giving us bullshit information rather than saying, I don't know,
Right.
or like not
Yeah,
saying
rather than
anything.
just saying, I don't know. Yeah.
That's really the scary thing. Also,
I
that
think that,
production could go on with if nobody says
yeah.
stop.
That's such a good insight, that this sort of inability to just accept a lack of knowledge leads to all kinds of bullshit. And it's like you see it in large language models and you see it in people. I feel like another thing that I learned from, writing a book that was about the meaning of life and what is a person and, what is AI and what is consciousness. Like I got very overwhelmed in engaging with these themes. And I also got very much to a place where I appreciated the limits of my knowledge, and I appreciated uncertainty and the role that uncertainty needs to play in our sort of quest to understand these bigger things.
It could be that that would be another way of looking at defining life because life is very important, and at the same time, it's open what life actually means in
Hmm.
this narrative or this exploration. And so, one thing I wanted to ask about was the meaning of vitalism or the tradition of vitalism, of this sort of valuing of life in its relation to something like humanism, meaning valuing human life more than, say, animal life or coral life. And then, and it has its reasons that might go beyond speciesism or like valuing what's closer to one more than what looks a little bit strange, because that actually is linearly connected to racism, and that's a worrying kind of tendency. But there's something about humans that, you can't really tell humans not to be humanists. That also seems weird, but it might be something that we need to think about.
Hmm.
But basically, what I wanted to say all over is the Chinese room image is
Hmm.
taken is a something that Searle proposes, and it's a weird topos that I've been thinking about a lot. Also because there's a weird racism to it that you can't quite put your finger on, but precisely the choice of this Chinese as something we all don't know, right? Except for
Hmm.
millions of Chinese people who are actually
Hmm.
producing a lot of the tech that we're running on, right? So
Hmm.
this sort of not knowing Chinese as normal is questionable. But anyway, the image, of course, is interesting. Is it enough to have a habit? Like William James, as pragmatist, said, we don't have like own information that we put in a box and then put in storage.
Hmm.
We Our information by going to the box, like by knowing where it is, by familiarity, as you say later.
Hmm.
So you're pointing to this Chinese room and re revisiting it and saying maybe it's the room itself, if it's not the man who speaks Chinese,
Hmm.
is a super interesting topos. And I wondered if you wanted to speak a bit more why you chose that topos and how maybe this leaving it open is a performative strategy of not answering questions, but of keeping alive the desire. Like maybe Zizek would say that's what we need to do if we want to have a life that's worth
Hmm.
living, rather
Hmm.
than just conserving life because
Yeah.
everything that has life stamped on it is good or something.
Right. I mean, if you're familiar with the Chinese room thought experiment, which this page can explain for you if you're not, but and I just want to say I had fun imagining a visualization of the man in the Chinese room with his little hole where he can just extend his hand. And yeah, the Chinese room thought experiment is interesting because it focuses so much on the output of knowledge, right? It focuses on like if something can just answer the question, right? If it's a sensical answer to the question, then that's like, sort of that's a vision of understanding. But I think the thought experiment is meant to get you to reflect on the like the sort of like lack of understanding that this output model might testify to. So the Chinese room, I think, is a very good, I mean, it was proposed as a way to understand um, artificial intelligence as a way of as a way of like um no, a disanalogy between the way that our minds work, right? Um, that we have like more of a sense of kind of understanding, that this Chinese room system is mechanized sort of situation is not a good analogy too. But when I was reflecting on the Chinese room, I came across all these different replies in philosophy. Um, and I came across this one that was called the systems reply, which is this idea that like, well, this man in the room is going through all these machinations and he doesn't understand Chinese, but if you zoom out and you kind of understand the system of the room, like the man and the books and the process that he's going through, that like the whole room is a kind of understanding. And that resonated with me because of this personal project I was doing where I was actually literally spending time in a room of my grandfather's artifacts and just sitting surrounded by information about his life, like all these documents that he'd saved, his dissertation, his journals, his newspaper clippings, photos, and just trying to feel like I had some sense of him, like I had some understanding. And I did actually feel like the man in the Chinese room. I was like the woman in the German room or something, although like there was also a lot of English in the room, but just like I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't feel like I knew him, like I knew his life. Like it was a really embodied experience of overwhelm. And there's a moment later in the book where my father's in the room with me, and he's like, "This is such a big task physically." Like he just kind of bemoans the intensity of what it is to be a human body processing information. And I did feel I had this like kind of profound experience with time and embodiment because the more time I spent in the room and the more time I spent with my grandfather's documents, the more I felt like I was internalizing something true about him and like getting to some kind of understanding. And that took specific shape when I couldn't read his handwriting at first. And then all of a sudden, after spending a lot of time with his handwriting, like I could just read it. And so I think that that experience like says something about embodiment and what it means to really know things as a human. It involves like physicality. And I think that that's just something that has not really been addressed or engaged with in the AI intelligence world.
Super interesting. Also, because if you think of what physicality is, even if you just take what can be described and has been described in biology, and you look at the time codes, I think there's a um, Meming Park, I think, has been looking at, what do you say, spike trains, where actually the re information is reduced of what the brain is reacting to in sort of typical neuroscientific tests, but they look at the rhythms of firing and try and see the sequencing, because the sequencing is actually a way to deal with the diversity of different probands. And that leads me to my last question, as we're already at 45 almost. But you music is really important here, and pattern recognition is another thing. And a lot of little details lead me to think about synesthesia a lot, like
Mm.
how we map one sense onto another. So I was wondering about your experience as a owner of senses, and then someone who plays on the senses as a comic artist. That so you have many different ways of getting at people at the same time. How is the pattern recognition of music or visual, so data, a way to sort of circumvent the bottleneck of language?
Mm. That's a great question. I was definitely thinking about the limitations of language uh, as the means through which we were, preserving the legacy of my grandfather at this time. Like all we had in this current moment in 2018, we were working on the chatbot, was his language to kind of use this technology on, because we had enough examples of his language. I should say that we do have copies of his musical performances, but a lot of the musical performances are not kind of like original compositions, right? It's like him playing Brahms or Chopin, and we don't have enough examples of that in order to really use any sort of like machine learning, reproductive pattern recognition technology on his music. So it's just to say that like what we had preserved of my grandfather, we were very limited by that in terms of what we could like use a kind of pattern recognition system on in order to give some longevity to. What we had were examples of his writing. And, if you read the book, you'll see like even that was quite limited. We had only certain kinds of writing and only, like it showed, it gave me insight into like a more public self of my grandfather, because there's a lot of cover letters, for example, like just him applying for jobs, and like that's a sort of slice of who he was. And in the book, I'm kind of longing for like something that's more, more inner. So there's so many limitations to language as a way to really sort of get to know this person and create a representation of him. And music, by the end of the book, I get to this realization that music is the most important thing to my grandfather and the way that he would want to be remembered. And so I did this experiment where I played his musical recordings and I tried to draw the music, which is impossible. Like it's not, but that's a kind of synesthetic experience that does come somewhat naturally to me. I have like a certain amount of synesthesia. I think most artists do. Like when I hear music, I do see shapes, and I was trying to put that onto the page in a way that's just very specific to me. And it's possible you can go on Spotify and actually listen to these recordings of my grandfather and let me know if you if you see similar shapes. But that was an experiment that I was doing because I think I just have this insight that, or this like intuition, strongly held intuition that there's something about translation and the kind of gaps between our sensory experience, like, or the gaps between genres. And this is a very cartoonist thought, but like the gap between a word and an image, or the gap between like a, sort of a song and a smell, the resonance, but the sort of fundamentally untranslatableness between these like different modalities. But the way in which our brains can form really strong associations between things across modalities, that's like really fundamental to intelligence. And I think that there are certainly AI experiments and sort of um, projects throughout AI history that have had that insight too. But I would say the current sort of machine learning, um, generative AI craze like is not really acknowledging that blurriness quite as much, and not really like leaning into that space of like, well, what's happening in a human experience when we have synesthetic experiences, or when we really have these strong associations between things that are like very specific to us and our lived experience.
Well, it's exciting to see what happens when certain rules are loosened and the when ChatGPT started to hallucinate last February, I think it was about a year ago, it was poetry. And I think that worked.
Mhm.
What excites me about these models is precisely their flatness, that they don't have a grammar, or they don't have a grammar on a basic level, but that the statistics of actually allow for any kind of association, except that they totally like say I have no associations, which is also a way of having all associations in some way. But I'm very curious where this will go, this development, because I feel like there's poetry in the background and it's being stifled, just as it is in most of us as we function in our everyday life, right?
Yeah, well, I think any sort of stifling of poetry is usually in the service of a marketplace and a kind of like usability, right? It's like, well, I'm also sort of interested in the hallucinations of large language models. Like, I think that's interesting if you call it a hallucination, right? Of course, it's very dangerous to take a hallucination and feed it to people as not a hallucination. But that sort of, yeah, that anxiety we have about sort of accuracy and the sort of like a lot of anxiety in this space is about liability. Um, and I like that anxiety is not really conducive to creativity. And so I think like, yeah, it's just I one impulse of my book is to try to encourage and champion artistry in technology. Like, I just think that anytime artists have a role in something, they make it better. They make it more humane. They drive things a little bit away from profits and towards like just they give space for other values to be present. And so I think like, if there's one note to end on, it's just the sort of asserting the artist's hand in these technological endeavors and just like making space for that because it's really scary how actually little space there is for that lately. Yeah.
That really is a great last word. And so let's listen to artists and not pressure artists to be too successful and give up
Yeah.
their whatever. Anyway, there is one question in the chat that I see asking if this process has changed the way you plan to preserve your own personal history or family history to pass on and share. I assume it's to you, Amy, right?
Mm. Yeah, I'm just
You see it too. Right?
opening up the Q&A. I don't see questions in the Q&A, but I see some in the chat. Oh, yes, I see that in the chat. Yeah, has this process changed the way I plan to preserve my own personal history? Yeah. So, I mean, I think something that's interesting in my case is that, I'm writing about AI and I'm still thinking about like what role AI and what role the digital world will have in kind of my legacy, but um, this process really emphasized for me the importance of drawing and writing as a way to like be kind of the like truest reflection of my identity. And I think, we all have a maybe different affinities for different forms. Um, my my forms are like my own words written in my own handwriting. Like that is the thing that feels truest to myself. So I think one thought I've been having recently is I've been keeping these diaries for, since I was 14 years old, and I'm just like very embarrassed by a lot of a lot of the things that are in there. And I'm wondering, what will the future think about me when they read my diaries? That's a thought I've been having, because if it's true that that's sort of like the truest sense of me, right? Me writing in my own hand. And handwriting is a really interesting thing that we could talk about forever. Because the process of translating handwriting into digital text, a lot is lost. A lot was lost. And I think, Anne, you probably know more about this than me, but like potentially that doesn't have to be lost. Potentially there's some unity, but some way that we can like um use a kind of union of robotics and machine learning and many other techniques like one day in the far future and actually preserve handwriting with the
I
capabilities of like actual generative language. That would be
think
very
there's a
interesting. Yeah.
So a lot of ways that one could weight the same technology. Like now we're very much focused on sort of performativity and maximizing certain values. And but if you also what your graphic novel also shows very well, I think, is that what we need is a diversity of media, of people, of roles. So it's not like one media is better or takes the place of another, or that like making your deceased loved one live on is going to replace their death or make his death
Exactly.
not there. But it's like there's an epitaph, there's like fixation. At the same time, there's recombination, or like making your thoughts continue to live by allowing them to change or to become more new things. And if both, usually both are happening, right? You have a certain amount of fixation. And I think in reading handwriting also, I mean, now I just was allowed to experience that Adobe is already able to sort of produce some more of the same if you give it like
Right.
a piece of artwork, and it'll produce just, you need 20 centimeters more than you actually drew on the paper because you miscalculated, and then you get another extra strip that looks really
Right.
similar. And as an
Right.
artist,
But
and you're sort of
like,
shocked.
what if we could reproduce,
Yeah,
the generative language capacities of LLMs and the image generative capacity of AI art and do them both at the same time? There's something like very, very difficult about that I have not seen yet, but I wonder when that's coming. And when
as
you
an
can
artist,
actually, yeah.
I feel sort of peeved and almost like, well, okay, then I won't draw if it's if it can be so easily reproduced. And it's not
Hmm.
that I'm against reproduction, but I think something about the pain that goes into, or the micro pain that goes into like labors of love and even rote tasks that you do, like drawing your frames or whatever. That's
Hmm.
where a lot of skill is and a lot of this sort of dedication. And there's a
Hmm.
beauty in that. And
Hmm.
somehow I wouldn't like to be reduced to the purely creative moments and give all
Well,
the rote tasks to someone else, right?
we don't want to be reproduced to our output, right? That's like back to the sort of Chinese room, like here, it's done. Like it's
That's the
all the
point, yeah.
labor that's going on inside of that room that is knowledge, that is embodied kind of understanding, that is like, yeah, the labor of love. I mean, what was so fun about drawing that Chinese room image was like all those little repeated images of right, of the man, um, like just how much labor he's doing. Like that's us, that's the artists. We're like we enjoy our process and I think like
Yeah,
I don't feel it's a little bit of a paradox. I don't feel upset about machines doing my job. I just don't think that them doing it means I'm not also going to do it. Like I'm going to do it because that's how I understand the world. The process is just so much a part of what it means to know something. Um, so yeah, I mean, my job as an artist could be a lot more efficient than it is, but I kind of like the slow, painstaking labor.
yeah. There's something really cute also about being, what is it, immortal,
Yeah,
like not living
cute.
forever, but also spending this lifetime doing senseless things as we do, as we love to do, and being a
Yeah,
scholar. Maybe that leads us to the last question in the chat. You see Catherine Di Paola, the concept
yeah,
of ownership of memory. And indeed, it becomes kind of absurd if only perishable actual human beings can be like legal subjects and responsible for owning something, right? Except
hmm
for corporational subjects that are legally also able to own stuff, unfortunately, maybe, but whatever.
mm.
Um,
So
but
this question is like, could AI change the ownership of memory because AI is not bound to time constraints? Yeah, I mean, I think what that question is asking is, what is the status of history if we have, sort of like digital characters that are continuing to replay the past as if it's the present? I think that's what that question is asking, and I think that's a very interesting question. And I feel like um that's sort of already like we already have these sort of virtual spaces where the past is present. That's what a memoir is. Like a memoir is a virtual space where the past is present. And I think that AI is very similar to a memoir, like or a novel. And like a big sort of thesis that I've come to in thinking about what AI characters are is that they are like characters in novels and plays and memoirs, and they are living in virtual worlds that we have to understand as virtual worlds. Um, yeah, I just published with my co-author Daniel Story an essay in Aeon that people might be interested in, which is about thinking about chatbots of the dead as characters in like a theater kind of participatory theater performances. So I feel like we aren't going to get confused about time if we understand the boundaries around AI characters as similar kinds of spaces as artistic spaces. They're fictional or they're not, or they're creative, non-fictional, whatever we want to call them, but they are happening in their own frames. And I think we already live in that world. Like that is the world of artists. And that's like that is reality. Like the past is very present for all of us, and artists are the ones that acknowledge that and engage with it.
That's a great way to put it together. Reminds me of the time when people started running away from the locomotive in the first early cinema um, experiences. And then
Mhm.
the one people are just focused on the reproduction of reality, but the
Mhm.
artists see the medium and what you can do
Mhm.
with it. And that's
Yeah.
really, art can teach us how to use new media, I guess.
Yeah, I think just we need to be looking to the artist to understand. And I think even like when I say artist, I don't mean high art. I mean like even like I think there's a lot of consternation about teenagers on the internet having relationships with fake people, right? There's a lot of consternation about that. But I'm like, that's an artistic experience, you know? It's just kind of
Mm.
a low art experience, right? But admiring the haircut of like the fake whatever influencer that's actually an AI, like getting all excited and kind of fangirling the influencer, like I think that's like that's play, that's what artists are doing. And like that one you might find not particularly um, inspiring, but I think if you understand it as play and as art, it's like much less scary. Which is not to say there aren't still concerns in those spaces, but I don't think the concerns are the delusion. I think the concerns have more to do with kind of what are how are those relationships being used for sort of bad ends or capital, sort of capitalist exploitation. But the actual play of like engaging with fictional characters represented by AIs, I think is like not something to be so concerned about. I think that's something to sort of understand charitably and maybe like in an artistic spirit.
And making stricter rules and regulations is not necessarily the way to really fix anything.
Yeah.
Also, like Legacy Russell was really good about writing in the Cyborg Manifesto. No, that's Donna Haraway in which feminism, how
Hmm.
playing in the internet really liberated her from being in her teenage body that she was so dysphoric about. And that's an
Yeah. I mean,
experience that we probably all share.
back to the theme of, excuse me, back to the theme of transcendence. Yeah. And that
Hmm.
I think play and artistry and technology has a role to play in helping people transcend those kinds of limitations. And yeah, I should just say like a kind of a shout out to my father as the central inspiring character in this book. His career has a lot of different twists and turns, but the part of his life that I've always been most interested in is the ways in which he has conceived of digital spaces as spaces for transcending your identity, your biologically determined identity. That's been something he's talked a lot about, and I think that's really powerful, and it's also a way. I mean, it's very utopian, of course, but I think that utopia is important to keep in mind that like actually we don't need to be determined by our biology, because there's something like special and spiritual and it just like there's something in each of us that is so much more than that, and I think that digital spaces they can represent the opportunity to explore that part of us.
Now, let's hope we also aren't determined by our sociology, and so the
Yeah.
internet remains accessible play space for all of us.
Yes. There is a question now in the chat. So should we ask people for their consent first to be reproduced digitally? Yeah, that's such an important question about consent. And um, I think
Especially when they're dead, right?
yeah, I think that one of the challenges in this space is that we don't know what we're asking people to consent to because the future is going to present us with infinitely more ways that we use the past. We use present technology to represent the past. And so I think when I get this question, I just think about the consent norms in writing memoir. And so, my parents, I've written two books about people who are alive and some of whom who are dead. My first book was about my mother and my grandmother who were both alive. I asked for their consent. There was a rigorous editing process, about the representation. There were quibbles about the final product of the representation, but there was a, sort of a trust in each other and a kind of loving process of understanding that my memoir is my perspective and that it's, we came to a kind of co-authored agreement about how that representation of those characters would live in the world. And in the case of this book, I have my father who's alive, my partner Jacob who's alive, but I have my grandfather who I never met. And the whole book is about trying to understand what he could think about anything, let alone what he could consent to. And so I think that's a really, really complicated question. How do you get consent for a representation of somebody who is not alive? And I think what you have to do is actually just think really hard and ethically about like, what do we owe to people? Like, what do we owe to their memory? And we can use information they've given us, but we also have to make some judgments that are a little bit more kind of objective ethics. Like, so I mean, this is such a longer conversation, but I came to sort of my own ethical code about representing people in with a loving gaze. And that has to do with using some judgments about what they want to keep private, sharing some of the things that I think make them seem like somebody who's deserving of admiration and love. And that's just like a judgment call that's personal. But I feel that the same kinds of questions are relevant to digital reproductions because I think of digital reproductions as artistic representations. And so there's first of all the question of whether or not it's public or private, because right, that you have different concerns, whether something's like available for everyone versus just available to a family member. Um, and then you have, decisions about what kinds of information you think, whether it's public or private, like should be feeding that digital reproduction. So anyway, I think a lot of those ethical questions are solved if you not solved, but are we have a framework for approaching them when you think about these things as artistic reproductions, not like authoritative digital reproductions, because I don't think that exists.
Maybe
Yeah.
there's a difficult part, but when you talk about access and restricted access, then protection becomes a very difficult question, right? Like, how much violence do you actually need to protect private spaces or like potential violence or something? But maybe it's better not to get into this because that raises some really, really tough questions. And
That's
Yeah,
something we
Um,
might do when we meet in October in Heidelberg, maybe. I think this has been a wonderful conversation with so many possibilities to continue thinking through things. And I think the graphic novel is almost a synesthetic experience when you read it. It's really you can experience it in so many ways. So I highly recommend to everybody to read it and to enjoy it and to join us in Heidelberg on October 16th, of course. So thank you so much, Amy, and thank you so much, Anne, for this inspiring conversation. And yeah, hope to see you soon. And to everybody, have a great day and a good evening.
Yeah, thank you so much to Lena and Catherine and especially Anne for your incredible mind. I really appreciate it.
yeah, thank you for the great opportunity. It's a super interesting conversation and also just for your work, which is a great, great pleasure to experience.
Thank you so
So I
much.
hope you keep on for a long time.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.